Picture this. A torch leaves a soldier's hand. No hesitation, no second thoughts. It smashes through the stained glass of St. Mark's Hospital, and within seconds the roof is roaring with flames. Inside, people are screaming. Outside, officers are watching in silence, calculating. It's September 23rd, 1529. The defenders of Vienna aren't fighting the Ottomans yet. They're fighting their own city. Scorched earth! The order echoes down the line. Burn the vineyards. Burn the estates. Burn the hospitals. Deny the enemy shelter. Deny them cover. Deny them anything that could be used against you. As smoke swallows the sun and turns noon into a gray twilight, you begin to understand the cold logic behind the madness. This isn't vandalism. It's survival. 16,000 defenders are about to lock themselves inside a stone cage and wait for the most powerful military machine on earth to arrive. The Siege of Vienna in 1529 doesn't begin with cannon fire. It begins with a city tearing off its own skin. Before we dive into this clash of empires, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe if you want more lost history like this. And tell me in the comments, what's the most desperate last stand in history that deserves its own documentary? Because the smoke rising over Vienna is the only warning Europe gets. Marching up the Danube is Suleiman the Magnificent, and he is moving like a landslide. Forget politics for a second. Look at the scale. Suleiman brings an army estimated at 120,000 men. This isn't a raid, it's a migration. His elite Janissaries drill in the mud. His Spahi cavalry sharpen their lances. His irregular Akinci riders have already swept through the Austrian countryside, torching whatever the Viennese didn't have time to burn themselves. His objective is simple: the Golden Apple, Vienna. If he captures this city, the gateway to Western Europe swings wide open. But there's a problem. Suleiman is racing the calendar. It's late September, and in the Balkans that year, it didn't just rain. It poured. For weeks. The roads dissolved into glue. This wasn't a matter of wet boots. It was logistical collapse. The mud was so deep it swallowed the Ottoman Empire's greatest weapon, its massive siege cannons. The bronze monsters that had smashed cities like Belgrade into rubble couldn't be dragged through Hungary's sludge. They were abandoned hundreds of miles away. So Suleiman reaches Vienna angry, delayed, and missing his knockout punch. Inside the walls, the math is horrifying. Vienna's defenses are medieval. Tall, thin stone walls built to repel knights, not gunpowder. 16,000 defenders stare out at the horizon and see an army that stretches for miles. Citizens hoard food. The city council panics. And then a 70-year-old mercenary steps forward. Nicholas Graf Salm doesn't waste time praying. He walks the walls, studies the stone, and understands immediately they won't hold. So he improvises. He orders streets ripped up. Paving stones are stacked against the ramparts. Houses are stripped of roofs to reduce fire risk. Behind the fragile stone walls, he builds a second defensive line of earth and timber, a shock absorber to catch the collapse when the bombardment begins. And he pays for it himself. While the treasury sits empty and the city's wealthy hide their silver, Salm melts down his own family heirlooms, plates, goblets, candelabras, and turns them into coin. He literally liquefies his legacy to keep the soldiers loyal. When the Ottoman vanguard crests the hills, they see a city wrapped in smoke. And Vienna sees something worse. A sea of white tents erupts around them in a perfect crescent, stretching for miles. The silence of the march gives way to drums, cymbals, and the high, piercing cry of Ottoman horns. The siege is about to begin. To understand why Vienna even had a chance, we need to leave the walls for a moment and step into the enemy camp. Imagine pushing aside the silk curtain of the Sultan's royal tent in late September 1529. Outside, Austria is a freezing swamp. Inside, the air smells of musk and rosewater. Gold thread glitters in candlelight. This is the mobile palace of Suleiman the Magnificent, poet, lawgiver, conqueror, the self-proclaimed shadow of God on earth. By this point in his reign, he has expanded the Ottoman Empire from North Africa to Persia. He wears a helmet shaped like a papal tiara, just to mock Europe's religious authority. But as he studies the map of Vienna and listens to rain lash against the tent walls, he knows something his court poets won't write. This campaign is already bleeding. The road from Istanbul to Vienna is nearly 1,000 miles, and almost every mile was soaked in relentless rain. The Balkans turned into rivers of mud. Camels, perfectly adapted to desert heat, died by the thousands. Their padded feet rotted in constant moisture. Oxen slipped and drowned in sludge. Soldiers fell to disease and exposure. The march to Vienna became a graveyard. And then came the fatal decision. Suleiman's master plan relied on the great bombards, colossal siege cannons that had reduced fortresses to dust. But in Hungarian mud, they were immovable anchors. He had to choose: wait and miss the campaign season, or abandon the heavy guns and press on. He chose speed. So when the Ottomans encircle Vienna, they do so without their wall smashers. They still have light artillery, deadly against men. But against stone fortifications, it's like throwing pebbles at a mountain. Even weakened, though, the Ottoman army is terrifying. To the defenders on the ramparts, the enemy camp looks like a city that grew overnight. White tents arranged in perfect geometric order. In European camps, you'd hear drunken brawls and chaos. Here, there is discipline, silence, order. At the heart of this machine stand the Janissaries. If mud is the chaotic force in this story, the Janissaries are pure discipline. Recruited as boys through the Devshirme system, taken from Christian families, converted, trained, and raised to serve only the Sultan. No marriage, no trade, no other loyalty. War is their family. In 1529, they are arguably the finest infantry in the world. Armed with matchlock arquebuses capable of piercing armor, they patrol the muddy perimeter, frustrated by damp gunpowder and freezing nights. Suleiman knows he can't starve Vienna out. Winter is closing in. He can't smash the walls. He lacks the heavy cannons, so he turns to fear. An emissary rides to the gates. The offer is simple: surrender now, and the city will be spared. Resist, and by the laws of war, Vienna will be given over to sack, the men killed, the women and children enslaved, the city erased. Inside the walls, Psalm and the council read the message. They know the odds. They know the Holy Roman Empire won't arrive in time. Logic says surrender, but logic already burned the suburbs. Instead of a written reply, Vienna answers with cannon fire. A thunderous volley erupts from the ramparts, tearing into Ottoman lines. Negotiations are over. The diplomacy of words has ended. The diplomacy of iron has begun. Suleiman watches from his silken tent. No outburst, no rage, just a nod. If the walls can't be knocked down from the outside, they will be opened from below. He orders the miners forward. The war for Vienna is about to go underground. While the Ottoman camp outside Vienna looked like a model of geometric perfection, the inside of the city looked like a riot in a tailor's shop. To understand the defense of Vienna, you have to understand the men hired to hold it. Meet the Landsknechts. If the Janissaries were warrior monks, the the Landsknechts were warrior rock stars. German mercenaries famous for two things: terrifying skill with the Zweihänder, a 6-foot two-handed sword capable of cutting down a man and the pike beside him, and fashion so outrageous it bordered on parody. They wore slashed doublets bursting with color, enormous codpieces, and hats drowning in ostrich feathers. In an age of strict dress codes, they had special exemption. They were loud, they drank hard, they gambled constantly, and they fought for one reason: money. Their unofficial motto said it all: Kein Geld, kein Deutscher. No money, no German. 3 days before the siege began, they nearly walked out. Vienna's treasury was either empty or locked away. Wealthy citizens hid their silver in cellars. Landsknecht captains surveyed the thin medieval walls, then glanced at the endless Ottoman host stretching across the horizon. They did the math. Dying for free wasn't in the contract. Mutiny wasn't theoretical. It was hours away. This is where Nicholas Graf Salm won the siege before it even started. 70 years old, a veteran of decades of warfare. He understood something the city council didn't. You can't eat patriotism. While officials debated and priests prayed, Salm walked into his own estate. He didn't emerge with a speech. He came out carrying silver, plates, goblets, heirlooms passed down through generations. He ordered it all melted. The wealth of his family line was turned into coins and poured directly into the hands of the mercenaries. The message was clear: I am all in. The mutiny evaporated. The peacocks picked up their swords. With the army secured, Salm turned back to the walls, his other nightmare. Vienna's fortifications were roughly 3 centuries out of date. Tall, thin, vertical stone curtains designed to stop ladders and battering rams. In the age of gunpowder, they were liabilities. A cannonball striking a thin wall doesn't bounce off, it shatters it. Modern fortresses in Italy had already evolved. The Trace Italienne, star-shaped bastions with low, thick, angled walls that absorbed and deflected artillery fire. Vienna had none of that. Salm had less than a week to improvise a military revolution. He couldn't rebuild the walls, but he could reinforce them. He ordered roofs stripped to reduce fire risk. Streets were torn up. Paving stones were piled behind the ramparts. Behind the stone curtain walls, he built earthen embankments reinforced with timber. Think of it like a crumple zone in a car. He knew the outer wall would fail. He was counting on it. When the Ottomans finally smashed through stone, they wouldn't find open streets. They would find another wall, earth and wood bristling with pikes and arquebuses. Vienna became an onion, layer after defensive layer. The gates were sealed, not with locks, but with masonry, bricked shut. There would be no fleeing, no surrender. As September faded into October, preparations were complete. The silver was spent. The streets were bare earth. The walls were patched with desperation and genius. On the ramparts, colorful Landsknechts stood shoulder to shoulder with nervous Viennese militia. Outside, Ottoman miners began to dig. The light artillery, what remained after the mud swallowed the heavy cannons, was dragged into position. Orders were shouted in Turkish, fuses were lit, and the siege shifted from construction project to slaughterhouse. If you ask a modern soldier about the hardest part of combat, they might say fear or exhaustion. Ask a defender of Vienna in October 1529, and they'd probably say something else. The noise. Before the first cannonball struck, the air filled with an alien, relentless sound. The Mater, the Ottoman military band, ancestors of modern marching bands. But this wasn't ceremony. It was psychological warfare. Massive kettle drums thundered like a heartbeat. Cymbals crashed. The piercing shriek of the zurna cut through the air like a blade. And it didn't stop. The Ottomans played in shifts. Day and night, the rhythm hammered against Vienna's walls. It was designed to break nerves, to deny sleep, to remind the defenders that the shadow of God was awake. Under this wall of sound, the bombardment began. Even without their massive siege bombards, the Ottoman artillery established batteries on high ground around the city. For days, iron pounded stone. The walls didn't collapse in one dramatic crash, but they weakened, flaked, crumbled. Dust filled the streets. Stone splinters tore through defenders on the ramparts. But Salm understood a crucial truth of siege warfare. Passive defense is slow suicide. You must disrupt the enemy. On October 6th, he gambled. The gates, briefly unsealed, opened. 8,000 defenders surged out in a massive sortie, led largely by Landsknechts and heavy cavalry. Half the garrison charging into mud and gunfire. Their target: Ottoman mining operations near the Corinthian Gate. They knew the real threat wasn't the cannons. It was underground. The clash was brutal and chaotic. Not neat lines, not elegant formations. Just men brawling in trenches filled with sludge. Heavy armored Europeans smashed into lighter Ottoman infantry. Pikes thrust. Arquebuses fired at point-blank range. For an hour, the trenches became a butcher's yard. The defenders managed to burn several mining shafts and kill hundreds of sappers before Janissaries arrived in force. Pushed back, the Viennese retreated behind their walls, dragging wounded comrades with them. But something had changed. They had drawn blood. The invincible Ottoman host could bleed. Yet they also saw the terrifying scale up close. The 8,000 who had charged out represented half their strength. The Ottoman reserve that pushed them back? Only a fraction of Suleiman's full force. And then the digging resumed. Not the drums, not the cannons. A faint scratching sound beneath cellar floors. The bombardment was a distraction. The sorties were a distraction. The real war was now 20 feet underground. Suleiman, frustrated that his artillery couldn't shatter Vienna outright, turned to his most dangerous specialists, sappers, engineers of destruction. Their mission was simple: dig beneath the city walls, pack chambers with black powder, and blow the fortifications apart from below. Inside Vienna, Salm anticipated this. He recruited experienced miners from the silver mines of Bohemia, men used to suffocating darkness and tight tunnels. These rough laborers became the city's most critical defense. But how do you fight an enemy you cannot see? The answer was terrifyingly simple. In cellars near the walls, defenders placed drums on the ground and sprinkled peas or beans across the stretched skins. Buckets of water were set nearby. Then they waited. If the peas trembled, if the water rippled, it meant the Ottomans were digging beneath them. When the peas danced, the counterattack began. Bohemian miners dug their own tunnels, aiming to intercept the enemy shafts. Imagine the moment of breakthrough. You're crouched in a cramped, airless tunnel barely wide enough for your shoulders. Your pickaxe breaks through into empty space. The earth collapses. And suddenly, you're face to face with an Ottoman sapper holding a candle. There's no room for swords, no room for pikes. Men fought with pickaxes, with hammers, with knives, in flickering light or total darkness, strangling each other in mud, choking on dust. If the defenders won, they flooded or collapsed the tunnel. If they lost, the fuse would be lit. On October 9th, the peas stopped dancing. The ground simply heaved. A massive explosion erupted near the Corinthian Gate. Stone and earth blasted skyward. The shockwave knocked men off their feet across the city. When the dust cleared, the defenders saw it. A breach, a jagged ramp of rubble leading directly into Vienna. This was the moment Suleiman the Magnificent had been waiting for. From the Ottoman lines, the Janissaries rose. Not a mob, a wave. White caps visible through smoke, advancing with terrifying discipline. They surged toward the breach before the dust even settled. But Salm had prepared for this. At the top of the rubble waited the Landsknechts. The breach became a meat grinder. Zweihenders swung in brutal arcs, shearing through spear shafts and limbs. Janissaries fired arquebuses at point-blank range. Smoke, blood, and screaming filled the narrow funnel of shattered stone. It was two military philosophies colliding. Disciplined precision versus heavy steel aggression. For hours they fought. The Janissaries could not push forward. The Landsknechts would not step back. Eventually, the Ottoman wave receded. Vienna had held. Barely. But the wall was broken. The illusion of safety shattered. The defenders looked at the rubble that used to be their rampart and understood something chilling. The ground beneath them was no longer solid. The next explosion could come at any moment. And winter was getting closer. By the second week of October, Vienna's greatest ally wasn't a sword or a cannon. It was the sky. On October 11th, the rain that had plagued the Ottoman march did something worse. It turned into snow. For the people inside Vienna, those first flakes felt like a miracle, a sign from heaven. For the Ottoman army, it was a logistical death sentence. You have to remember, this was a summer campaign army. The men surrounding Vienna were dressed for Mediterranean heat, not an Austrian winter. Silks and cotton, light cloaks, thin boots. Now they stood in freezing sludge. The once pristine white tents sagged under snow. Frostbite crept into fingers and toes. Camels that had survived the mud simply lay down in the cold and refused to rise. Disease, dysentery, typhus spread through the camp faster than any Christian cannonball. The stench was unbearable. Rotting animals, open latrines, unburied dead. Some accounts say the smell drifted over the walls into the city itself. But the real temperature drop wasn't in the air. It was in morale. The Janissaries, arguably the finest infantry in the world, were professional soldiers, and professionals know the rules of campaigning. You do not fight in winter. The mud made charges nearly impossible. Damp powder misfired. Forage ran out. They stared at Vienna's battered but standing walls and began to whisper. Why are we freezing for a city we cannot eat? Suleiman the Magnificent heard those whispers. He was no fool. A sultan who pushes his Janissaries too far often ends up deposed or dead. He knew time had run out, so he made one final gamble. On October 12th, he convened a war council. There would be one last all-out assault. No more probing attacks, no more careful mining, everything. And to motivate his exhausted army, he didn't promise glory. He promised greed. If Vienna fell, the normal rules of booty would be suspended. Promotions, riches, total plunder, winner takes all. The date was set, October 14th. Inside the city, Nicholas Graf Salm saw the shift immediately. The mining slowed. The casual bombardment ceased. The Ottoman lines tightened. They were coiling. Salm, aching from sleepless weeks, inspected the defenses one more time. The Corinthian gate was little more than a mound of rubble and reinforced earth. His men were starving, exhausted, terrified. The next 24 hours would decide everything. Dawn on October 14th, 1529, arrived with a single shattering roar. Every remaining Ottoman cannon fired at once. The concussion rattled glass from windows across Vienna. Then came silence. And then, another sound. A human roar. Suleiman had kept his word. He threw everything forward. The attack slammed into the breaches near the Corinthian gate. This wasn't finesse. It was blunt force trauma. Janissaries surged ahead in dense formation, white caps cutting through smoke. They climbed over their own fallen comrades, scrambling up blood-slick rubble, shouting prayers as they advanced. Inside the breach, chaos erupted. Salm formed his landsknechts and Spanish arquebusiers into a solid wall of steel. When the first wave crested the rubble, they were met with a point-blank volley. The front rank simply vanished. But the men behind didn't stop. They pushed forward, driven by desperation and fear of failure. The breach was too narrow for proper formations. Pikes tangled. Men dropped long weapons and drew short swords, daggers, anything they could swing in the crush. It became a mosh pit of death. And then, at the worst possible moment, Vienna nearly broke. Salm was everywhere, shouting orders, reinforcing weak points, physically shoving men back into line. And then something struck him. Accounts differ. Falling masonry. A fragment of cannonball. It shattered his hip. The 70-year-old commander collapsed in agony. For a split second, the defenders saw him fall. That could have ended everything. Instead, it ignited them. The landsknechts, seeing the man who had melted his own silver to pay them bleeding in the mud, fought like demons. They formed a hedgehog of pikes around his body. They pushed back with raw, furious strength. Outside the walls, the Ottoman momentum began to falter. Janissaries were exhausted, their robes heavy with freezing mud. The promised riches looked distant, imaginary. There was no gold in the breach, only cold steel. Slowly, agonizingly, the tide turned. The cries of attack became cries of retreat. The wave broke. Janissaries scrambled back down the rubble, slipping in blood and slush. By early afternoon, silence returned. The breach was clogged with bodies, so many they formed a grotesque new rampart. Vienna still stood. Inside, there was no celebration. Salm was carried away on a stretcher, pale and fading. He would linger for months, but in truth, he died that day on the walls. Outside, Suleiman watched the retreat. He did not rage. He did not order another charge. He turned away. The gamble had failed. On October 15th, snow fell thicker and faster, covering the dead in white. Retreat was inevitable, but an Ottoman retreat was not simple. The army had to lighten its load. Horses were dying, supplies were gone. Anything that couldn't move under its own power had to be abandoned. And there were thousands who could walk. Prisoners. During the march through Austria, Akinci cavalry had captured peasants, men, women, children, intended for slave markets in Istanbul. Now they were liabilities, mouths to feed. Suleiman gave an order that stains his legacy. Leave nothing behind. He did not mean free them. As the Viennese watched from the walls, expecting to see tents struck, they saw fires erupt instead. Tents burned, equipment burned, and then the screaming began. Ottoman soldiers turned on the captives. Some were herded into flames, others cut down where they stood. A massacre. The defenders, who had just repelled the greatest army on earth, stood helpless as their own countrymen were slaughtered beyond arrow range. By the time the last Ottoman columns disappeared into mist along the Danube, they left behind a ring of corpses and ash. Inside Vienna, church bells rang, but the city was starving, ruined, traumatized. When scouts rode out, they saw how close annihilation had been. The heavy siege cannons were absent. If the rains hadn't swallowed them, if winter had come a week later, the fires outside might have been Vienna itself. Suleiman recorded the campaign briefly in his diary, framing it as a successful raid. But Europe understood the truth. The tide had struck a rock, and the rock had held. When spring arrived in 1530, Vienna was free, but it had lost its father. Nicholas Salm never fully recovered. Infection set in. In May 1530, he died from the wound he'd suffered defending the breach. He was buried in St. Stephen's Cathedral. His tomb does not show a saint at prayer. It shows a soldier in armor. Zoom out to the map of 1529. The Protestant Reformation was just beginning. Martin Luther was shaking Europe's religious foundations. The Holy Roman Empire was divided. If Vienna had fallen, the road into the German heartlands would have opened. A fractured Europe might have faced an Ottoman superpower without unity. History could have bent in an entirely different direction. Instead, Vienna held. The failure in 1529 marked the high watermark of Ottoman expansion into Central Europe. The city immediately rebuilt, tearing down obsolete medieval walls and constructing modern bastions built for gunpowder warfare. The footprint of those fortifications still shapes Vienna today. History feels inevitable when we look backward, but 1529 proves it isn't. The siege wasn't decided by destiny. It was decided by rain, by mud, by a 70-year-old mercenary who chose to melt his silver rather than surrender. Change one variable, a week less rain, a slightly different mine placement, and the call to prayer might have echoed from Vienna's cathedral for centuries. Civilization isn't permanent. It's maintained, funded, defended. The people of 1529 weren't trying to save Western civilization. They were just trying to survive until the snow fell. And this wasn't the end. The Ottomans remembered the Golden Apple. For 150 years, they looked west. In 1683, they would return in even greater numbers. And next time, Europe would need a miracle on horseback. If you want to see that sequel, the arrival of the winged hussars and one of the largest cavalry charges in history, make sure you're subscribed with notifications on. And before you go, I want your take. Was the Ottoman failure in 1529 simply bad luck and brutal weather? Or was Vienna's defense truly superior? Let me know in the comments. Until next time, remember, history may be written by the victors, but it's decided by the survivors.